Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar in the Knowledge Miles series, part of the Lord Mayor's lectures on behalf of Professor Michael Mainelli, whose theme for his mayoral year is Connect to Prosper. In this free online lecture series, we address the connections in and around the square mile, which Michael likes to call the world's coffee house, and how these might help us to tackle future global challenges. I'm Professor Tim Connell, I'm Chairman of the Gresham Society and a Fellow of Gresham College here in the City of London. I'll be convening this session and taking the questions and answers afterwards. Now, we have a plan for today, a brief introduction from myself, the keynote lecture from Ketan Patel, and then we have 20 minutes or so for questions and answers afterwards. Today, we have a really interesting topic, capital as a powerful force for global impact. We're delighted to have Ketan Patel with us today. He's a senior figure in the City of London, having held positions with Goldman Sachs, KPMG and Hewlett-Packard. Today, he is the CEO and co-founder of Greater Pacific Capital, as well as the founder and chairman of Force for Good, established in support of the UN Secretary General's Roadmap for Sustainable Development. Ketan, perhaps you could kick off by telling us a bit about yourself.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the Lord Mayor for arranging something so interesting to do and to communicate our mission and values. So I think you've summarized very well, actually. So if I explain a little bit of the background of what we do. So I've had multiple careers. One of them has been in industry, one has been in consulting, and one has been in banking. And then we established an investment firm to invest for profit and impact, headquartered in London, investing in emerging markets. And I was delighted because we published a lot of research which captured the attention of many people around the world, but led to the United Nations inviting us to help them think about how the world could be leveled up and how capitalism could be a force for doing that. And in the process of helping them think about that, I ended up establishing with the team something which we now call Force for Good. And Force for Good is an interesting endeavor. It looks at capital flows around the world and how those flows are channeled towards making an impact, a positive impact in the world. And so, Tim, that's essentially the mission of Force for Good, to see these flows of capital, to see if they could be influenced to do even more good.
Excellent. Well, I think we all look forward to hearing how capital can indeed be a powerful force for global impact. Over to you, Ketan.
Thank you very much, Tim. I would say that growing up in London, it provides you an enormous platform, an advantage in some ways, because you're at the center of one of the greatest hubs of finance in the world anyway. And if you grow up in the city and you're exposed to some of the financial institutions and the intellectual property and the vibrancy really of this city, I think you come with an advantage. So I was delighted to be able to pursue a career like that. Today, I'd like to walk you through, though, some of the findings of our work at Force for Good and what we now do with it and how it leads to making a positive impact itself, rather than just researching and influencing, how it seeks to actually see if it can do something that makes a direct impact. And in this sense, it helps also that we're an investment firm in Greater Pacific Capital, and we have a background in capital itself and the allocation of capital. So in terms of Force for Good and what it does, let me see if I can briefly just take you through some of the work and how it works with financial institutions around the planet. So the mission you see, the mission is quite bold, is to influence the deployment of capital as a force for Force for Good in the world at this enormously difficult juncture, it seems. But we believe it's a juncture where the world is in a transition, of course. It's a transition from an industrial age to an information age, which, if we look in history, is always a complicated place to be and can lead to enormous conflict between old powers and rising powers. And it just so happens at this time, we also have a transition where we began this century with about 6.4 billion people. And by 2050, we expect there to be 10 billion people. Just that itself would be enormous. But we also began this century with America as the unipolar power, and we're already moving towards a multipolar world, with many powers now rising, including China. The EU is a great power, and India is rising as a great power too. So we have multiple transitions happening at the same time. And I think at this time to see what can be done to make this transition smooth or smoother, and what can be done to level up the world so that the platform is stronger. And that's part of the mission of Force for Good. Essentially, we're leaving behind an old civilization built from fossil fuels. And in the next decade or two, we can expect to see some enormous changes. One of them is, of course, the end of fossil fuels. The second is actually the end of a Western geopolitical dominance of the world itself. The third, as I said, is this system of power led by America, which is getting diversified now. The fourth, which is heralded really and sped up really through the COVID transition and the pandemic, is the end of the primacy of everything that is physical in favor of things that are more remote, more virtual. And so we're seeing that transition too, where value is shifting from things that are physical and made only in the physical world to things that are sold and traded, of course, online. The end of the value of labor itself, as we find that artificial intelligence places value on very different things, and we place value enormously on technology. And unfortunately, in that transition, we'll see enormous jobs go away. And so this is a fracture almost in what we've come to trust and rely on in terms of where our jobs come from and our value comes from. The end of contained populations. The UN doesn't expect migration to stop. It thinks that over 1 billion people will migrate across countries, across boundaries. And so migration is almost a feature of our existence going forward. And what that means for us is, of course, enormous disruption. And how we react to those migrants and how we figure out how many we can swallow, how many we can live with, how many we can make productive in our societies, of course, changes everything. Also, the key resources that we've come to rely on are becoming more and more difficult to dig up, causing more and more problems in terms of climate change and pollution, fracturing the planet too. And the end of the key resources is expected. We expect a peak, of course, to many resources in their usage. And then the end of income equality. There was a notion, almost the idea of income equality, but we're finding that actually income inequality is magnified across the world. And this seems to be a feature of capitalism at this point today and of societies today. And as we're seeing, as more and more wars kick off, we have them in 2 continents today. And there is the possibility of one happening in Asia between China and Taiwan, or accidentally even triggered by some of the fractures on borders. And so the end of peace, and probably the peace dividend that we came to expect post Second World War, leading to the notion of a perpetual war, a perpetual state of conflict. And so these are the markers, if you like, of the end of the basis of the last civilization. The next one should be gloriously better, of course, but it depends how we manage this transition itself, and this one finishing and the next one starting. And that itself is usually, if you look at history and the end of different eras and different civilizations, it's a fractious process of change. The curves, which I won't go through, but actually mirror something I've just spoken about, is that you see a number of things declining, and you actually see a huge number of things rising. The rise of alternatives, the rise of science, the rise of AI and data, and online trading. So you're seeing a series of declines and a series of rises. And the question is the gap in between. How big is that gap? How steep is it? How disruptive? What impact will it have on all of us? And I think herein lies the challenge of managing this transition peacefully. It will also shape enormous global flows. And what we see in these global flows is the 5 big ones that we think change enormously: trade flows, capital flows, population flows, information flows, and energy flows. These 5 are the big 5, which, as we transition through all of these things and they change our society, change where the wealth is, where the peace is, where the conflicts are, whether we're capable as a species of actually getting together and deciding to do it well. unfortunately, if we do the score, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, as we refer to them, are a phenomenal thing that the world did. Every single country in the world agreed that we wanted to create a better world. They agreed the 17 dimensions along which we would measure our progress, and underlying those are 170 or so individual metrics. And we agreed that we would all do this together, and we would take something like 15 years from 2015 to 2030 to level up the world. It was an enormously ambitious thing to do, and probably one of the most noble tasks that the world set on. Unfortunately, as the UN took the score at the halfway point this year in September, we find that none of the targets are on track. The underlying metrics of 170 or so different indicators, only 15% of those sub-indicators are on track. And everything else is either stalled, or in some cases, because of the pandemic, because of the wars, has actually fallen behind. And so things like poverty have actually increased. If you look at the world and you say, where are the biggest shortfalls and what do we have to do to fill those? You find that actually there's a lot of small countries, poor countries, particularly in the global south, that are falling behind and have not managed to get any hand really to catch up in a big way. But you also find that a lot of the ability to achieve the SDGs will rest on a smooth transition of India from a poor country to a middle-class country, and doing it in a manner which is sustainable. And the same for China, that lots of small countries plus these two big ones really, really matter. And they depend in some ways on trade continuing to flow across the world from the rich countries to the poor. At the same time as this, one of the biggest setbacks in the SDGs is that rich countries have enormous pockets of poverty. And unless that is solved, why would those countries vote to help the poorer countries? And I think this is part of the now complexity of the challenge that we face, that the size of poverty, the scale of poverty rather, and the size of the populations inside the richest of countries is growing for the poor and for the people that are underprivileged and don't really get to participate. And so the instability, political, social, and economic, is growing inside richer countries too. And so there's an imperative really to really magnify the impact, for us to redouble the efforts and more to make this happen. We tried to estimate what it costs to close that gap, and it's enormous. It's unaffordable, I would say. So the various estimates placed it around $30 to $40 trillion, and we did a bottom-up look at all the poverty and all the SDGs and all the changes potentially that would be required based on the terms set by the UN in 2015, and updated that for things like inflation, things like wars, and we tried to figure out what does it really mean in terms of the cost. And the cost is somewhere between 100 trillion and 137 trillion dollars. To put that into context, the world has approximately $450 trillion of capital, of liquid capital. It could not afford to do that without some radical changes as to how we spend money, what we spend it on, and the way we spend it too. So this is a task almost too big unless there is a huge amount of innovation. And actually the good news is it can be done. But before I get to that, let me also say this, that there is a notion, a very important notion. I'm part of something called the World Academy of Art and Science. It's a fantastic institution set up by Oppenheimer, Einstein, Bertrand Russell, set up post the Second World War, probably in a moment of great pessimism and guilt, that actually the world had unleashed an atomic weapon that would threaten the stability of the whole world. And they established an institution to see if peace could be established, combining the arts, the humanities, and the science, and facilitating that dialogue, as well as bringing its own influence and thinking to bear, drawing in lots of others to see if some big change could happen. And the United Nations launched a very important campaign called Human Security for All, which the World Academy is its partner for, and Force for Good is a partner too of that. The leadership of the World Academy in launching this massive campaign has been quite important, and it's been launched to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people across the world, and hoping to reach millions and tens of millions and billions ultimately. What we did was we took the parameters of human security as defined in that work, compared it to the SDGs, and what you find is the two, of course, completely overlap. We can't have security for all unless we meet the SDGs, unless countries are secure for food and water and energy and education and so on. And so the two completely overlap. Our ability to have security depends very much on us achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And achieving the Sustainable Development Goals requires us to have security. And of course, we're in a time of enormous insecurity in the world. There are enormous consequences of failure, and I should not spend too much time on them, but I think you all know what they are, and we feel them all in our lives, and we see them all in the news, and one would be forgiven for believing that the world was in such a bad place that it was irrecoverable. That isn't true, but we are facing at once, and this is not peculiar to times in history when there is a global transition, when, if you like, the engine of prosperity, which built a civilization, runs out because the demands are too great. It's almost been too successful, the demands too great, and it can't meet them. And so we face, maybe in some of these uniquely, but some in common with history, a climate catastrophe, a water crisis, mass migration. We're making so many species extinct globally, enormous education gaps between the rich and the poor, the haves and have-nots, gender gaps which seem unbridgeable, an ongoing and persistent poverty now, structural poverty in many parts of the world, an economic opportunity cost that we are finding very difficult to close, and enormous political impacts as a result in terms of populism, misinformation, a shift to the extremes of politics, the far right and the far left, but particularly the far right. And so you see this shift, which is catastrophic potentially for stability. Our analysis also shows, though, that there are 4 power blocks emerging in the world, which, if they could work together, could actually solve these issues. And the 4 are the US, the EU is the biggest trading bloc in the world, China, and over time, as early as the period between 2030 and 2040, India would join those 3 too, to make a 4-part power bloc, or series of powers, great powers. Between them, they have 90% of the global capital markets, 71% of defense expenditure, and then somewhere between 40 and just over 60% of GDP, trade, population, and arable land, so that the ability to provide food for the world. And so this is what makes them so powerful. And actually it places on them, with this power, the need to actually be very responsible citizens. The news is not so good when we analyzed the hubs like London, Tokyo, New York, Singapore, and so on, that are financial hubs in different parts of the world, to say what happens to those hubs over time as we face all these challenges, as these great big 4 giant power blocks emerge with enormous trading clout. And to agree with any of those 4, a trading treaty, you'd almost be at the mercy of their power. So what does it mean for where the money will flow through? And what we find is New York continues to prosper because America is one of those great power blocks. And as you'd expect, the EU's financial centers come to the fore and rise through the charts and become important, as do China's, and China has multiple ones, but you can expect them to consolidate around maybe 2, maybe 3, and India too would expect to see the same. And as a result, other power blocks that are not intrinsically aligned with those 4 would find themselves declining in terms of their status. And the risk to London is just that. Unless London were mission aligned to one of those other great blocks and their centers and their hubs, it would suffer in the process of this transition of great power. Based on the underlying metrics, we made ourselves very solution-oriented in our last report, and our reports have transitioned from the first ones we produced, which were about 4 years ago, where we started to analyze the money, where it goes, how it flows, who has it. And we looked at 100 of the largest financial institutions in the world in our last 2 reports. I think the last one was 125 actually. And we produced a report also called Technology as a Force for Good, where we looked at the 100 largest tech companies in the world. The report's available online on our website, forcegood.org, and it gives you a lot of information. These reports are designed to serve the public. There are 140 pages, short summaries at the front, but they give you enormous details on the strategy of the technology companies, the technologies that might shape the future, capital, how people see it through different lenses, the SDG lens, the impact lenses, of course, ESG lens, citizenship lenses to make an impact to communities and so on. It's very granular, very detailed, also very qualitative. Looking at everything we could see, and we're very privileged, we collect something like 450 or so data points across all these institutions, financial and technological. And we can see, therefore, patterns of things. And taking all those patterns, we started to look at underlying them. If you match them to the SDGs and you look at them at the level of the SDGs, indicators underneath those, the 150 to 170 key indicators, what does it tell us about how you solve for the problems we've just talked about? And the really positive thing was that the SDGs were designed to be solved. They were designed for us to meet the targets. And what we find is, this page summarizes some of it, but I'll say this, that 1/3 of the targets nearly are solved through policy. It requires governments all over the world to set policies that implement good governance, that encourage people to not do damage to each other, to their communities, to the environment, so on, to level up and share more, so on. And so policy really matters. It's 1/3. Another 1/3, much more difficult to change, is public sector spend and activity. If that spend and activity is conducted in a manner that is much more sustainable, much more likely to make a positive impact, that's 1/3 of the impact of the SDGs. And 1/3 is the private sector, technology, infrastructure, industry, finance, and so on. In some ways, it was quite interesting to see that finance directly is only a small part of the solution. It does, though, manage money, almost 70% or so of the world's money, 70, 80% of the world's money. So it's an enormously powerful force in terms of managing it. But the money is owned, interestingly, 2/3 by individuals and 1/3 by governments. And I think the unsaid in all of that is the most powerful force for change actually is the individual as an enlightened, aware, responsible citizen making powerful decisions at the point of purchase or at the point of the voting box. And so these are some of the changes still to come. But 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 between policy, government spend, and the private sector. I wish we found technology is an enormous force that underpins almost all of it. It can make a nearly 20% direct impact on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. In other words, in terms of impacting poverty and hunger and education and so on, and climate change and so on. But it can make a 40% impact as it works with the other stakeholders, the public sector and the private sector, to magnify their impact. As we looked at that, here's what we found. Those 3 forces, policy, public sector, private sector, and the solutions we identified, which is in our report, can solve 100% of the solution. And if they were implemented with the most impact they could possibly make, so everyone stretching to really make the biggest impact they could, using technology, using finance, using infrastructure, using government spend, using industry, and so on, we would well exceed the original target set by the world for ourselves. We'd be 156% of the original goals. And that was a source of enormous positive celebration almost, that this could be done. And our message, as we released our report around the UN General Assembly, was that actually the solutions are within our grasp. And what we did do was go a step further and say, look, it isn't easy because this is more difficult than putting a man on the moon. A man on the moon was one country in competition with another country, mobilizing their own resources to see if they could get it done. And it costs something like $200 billion in inflation dollars today. Now, this challenge, though, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, is every country, with no one being able to call the shots, giving to each other, sharing its intellectual property, its solutions with each other, shifting capital as a result to follow those solutions, to actually level up the world. That's the real challenge. That's the challenge of our times and our transition. To make it even more real, what we did was we looked for solutions to illustrate really that this could be done. And we found 15 great solutions. Some of those are policy solutions. Some of those are public spend. Some of those are private sector. There's a range of solutions. For example, at one extreme, we have the EU as the leader in setting policy. Another extreme, we have a series of banks actually in the US, deciding that actually it was not okay that they had a substrata of their community, the Black community in particular, that were underprivileged, didn't have jobs, and they wanted to solve it. And between them, they committed more than $10 billion to actually seeing if they could solve that. These financial institutions also committed trillions to climate change. And so you can see that actually it's quite wide. We also saw that there was a technology, a fintech technology, intersection of finance and technology, which the Indian government had implemented, which in the last 8 years or so have allowed 500 million people to open a bank account, to get a savings product, to get an insurance for free, to get healthcare, critical healthcare for free, to be given a payment system access for free, to transact with each other just off their phones. So there are solutions out there. There are enormously exciting, innovative solutions out there. None of this is waiting. And these are just 15 solutions we identified that we thought were worth showcasing. Just those can solve 70% of the SDG gap. And so this is very achievable, was our conclusion from this work. We took those and we put them across the different parameters. How many of those are policy, how many of the digital, public sector, and so on. And how radical are these solutions and how magnified can their impact be? And it's exciting. Some of these make small impact, some make a magnified, huge impact in the world. And mass financial inclusion, where every person has access to a bank account, is possible and within our grasp. Indeed, today's financial system really only caters well for about a third of the world. To provide it properly to the 2/3, some of those 2/3 are hidden within rich countries, but a lot of those in the global south. To level that up, the technology is available, the distribution is available, the financial products are available. It's just down to us to execute it, to all of us to execute it, to make sure it happens. We were happy that we got to present the case for sharing the financial system that India had created with the rest of the world. And the United Nations was the venue at which the Indian government hosted the event to make the offer to the world. And I was delighted to be one of the panelists to present why that was so important for the planet. And that happened this year on the 4th of May in New York at the UN headquarters. So it was delightful to see Force for Good as part of the group that believes this can happen. And clearly, this has been 8 to 10 years or more of effort inside a country that's very poor to see if they could create the solution, the technology solution, as a platform, align the policies, the financial institutions, the technology industry, get it executed, and then roll it out. And now it's available to be rolled out across the whole of the world to whoever wants it. And many countries are lining up, of course, to take it. Just to wrap up, Force for Good thinks there are a number of initiatives that we should be pushing, doing the analysis for, doing the thinking, making the case, and then working with stakeholders and partners to have that happen. The World Academy, as I said, is one of our partners. Wherever we can, we work with the United Nations to see if they would support these things and we could support them. They are the front line in many places making that change happen. And the themes are big ones, ones that matter, I'm sure, to all of us. Affordable housing, mass education, mass financial inclusion, impact by the individual for good. So the individual is a powerful force for good themselves. Biodiversity and the pricing of externalities are unaccounted for impact in the world. So we account for it properly. And so we make wiser decisions, really. Climate change is something that has a lot of emphasis already and has a long way to go, and we're not succeeding at the moment as humanity. And we believe there's one more, which is enlightened, aware leadership, great leadership, to really drive the world in the right direction. And we've come across somebody who's done a lot of good work on that and has solutions for that as to how you raise the level of enlightened awareness almost inside people who are leaders in all walks of life, in their families, in their communities, in companies and enterprises and government, and so on, NGOs and so on, to make a difference. So this is some of the effort that we're putting in, and some of the effort that we know we have to get funded so that we can do this good work. And that's the story I want to tell you today. And let me stop there and hand it back to Tim so we can have a discussion on it.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Ketan. Some very interesting points there. You do verge between the positive, the negative, and the possible. As an individual, are you a half glass full or a half glass empty man?
Oh, I'm a half glass full and a believer that actually my power can make the full glass, the glass wholly full. So I'm a believer.
Oh, splendid. Now, Dan Feeney here asks, how does a massive pile of global debt plus the dependency on the American dollar resolve in the multipolar world going forward?
Yeah. So there is a massive amount of debt, and China seems to be one of the biggest countries holding that debt. And we face this almost perennial problem where the poor need to take debt. The interest rates for the poor are high because of the risk that providers feel that they hold. And so the interest rates are high, they can't afford to pay it off. The structural issues they have are not solved. And so you end up then having to write the debt off again. The diversification of the dollar is happening as the Chinese and others become countries that also provide this debt. One of the most innovative things we saw was a debt for nature swap, and that's transforming into also a debt, potentially a debt for social impact swap, where a solution is we have a country that has enormous debt. It's a poor country. We're required to write that off so the country can have a new start. The question mark is, should it just be written off completely? Should it be swapped for them looking after a rainforest or a natural oasis or reserve of some type that is good for the planet, or a social impact? And would that justify putting in some more capital so that can happen? And these sorts of ideas have been tested now with billions of dollars, not trillions yet, but billions of dollars, and found to work. And so there are solutions out there. They're not quite scaled at the level they need to be, but I'm delighted to say that people are thinking in this innovative fashion to find solutions to do this for very poor countries who have enormous debt, and they want to swap it for something which is an impact. So, it's still positive, Tim, in terms of how people are thinking about this. We're just not at the scale level required for it to really move the needle enough. And that is our challenge going forward.
Right. Well, John Knights has come up with one. When you say the end of a civilization, what time period do you have in mind, especially as relative peace in the world has only really been a feature since World War II?
Yes, so we did a piece of analysis, and we did it first post September the 11th when I was at Goldman Sachs. We did it again about a decade or so later, and we did it again about 3 years ago. This was done from our work at Greater Pacific Capital, and we did a mathematical calculation. Here's what we did. In each case, we took about 30 of the most significant empires in history. We did a mathematical plot of how long were they an empire and how much land did they conquer. And so if you plot that, you find there are 3 types of curves that emerge, but there's a pattern that they're all a rise and a fall over a certain period of time. And the most significant empires in terms of the largest acquire the most amount of land in the shortest amount of time and then fall the fastest. America arguably did not conquer the land by putting their own military and governance on the ground, but did it through trade and did it through multinationals. So it was slightly differently done. And so we looked at that to say, when does that fall and what does it mean? And we also looked at it to say, what was the underpinning of each civilization? What were the natural resources, the technologies, and so on? What we find is we're in the midst of a fall now, which probably began, and historians will ultimately figure this out in terms of what the exact timing is, but it probably began at the fall of the Berlin Wall, when it was clear that the Soviet method of creating value was not going to persist and help the world sufficiently to be prosperous and include enough people. And
Right.
capitalism in some form would do that work. And as a result, America's share at that point of global GDP declined as more countries embraced that, as China did in particular.
Yes.
And that fall in share is what happens when an empire or a great power peaks and then starts to decline. And so that decline is long, though. The important date is the date when another great power intersects with the decline of one great power. And that for America would be somewhere between 2030 and 2040 to 2045 in terms of the maths of it. So it's absolutely true. We're in a period where we had peace for a short period, and we're in a transition which is going to risk that peace unless great leaders can get together and decide we don't do that, and the public demands it.
Yes, a negative one coming from Matthew Leach is asking which countries so far have done most to derail progress on the SDGs. Are there any commonalities between these countries?
Okay. I would say this, that actually, in all the work that we did, what we found was there is a way of life we've all got used to. And the way of life we've got used to is a consumer-based way of life. Mass consumerism underpinned this form of capitalism that we've all enjoyed, that has made the people on this call and many of the people that will watch this, particularly in rich countries, prosperous. And the basis of it, the basis of this form of capitalism is you will be happy and you'll be successful if you gather money and you spend it. And if you keep spending it, it drives GDP, it drives production, it drives jobs, and ultimately it makes you prosperous. And there's a sleight of hand there which has convinced us that spending and happiness are linked. And so we will vote out of government anybody, as citizens, who doesn't deliver the ability for us to keep making more money and to keep spending and to keep driving, therefore, the exploitation of the planet, almost the asset stripping of the whole planet to serve us. We expect the supply chains of the whole planet to serve the rich countries, the 1/3, really. And amongst that 1/3, the 10% and then the 1% probably take the most. And so who is that? It's the richest of countries. It's America, and it's Europe, and it's Japan, and increasingly it's Australia. We take the most out of the planet, and it's us who risk it by not changing fast enough.
So what are your main recommendations, Clive Gooden asks, for the UK government to help with SDG goals, especially what they aren't doing at the moment?
That's a great question. It's a difficult one too, because here we are post the pandemic and post leaving the EU, no longer anchored in some way to one of the biggest trading blocs in the world, with no trading deal really with America that really matters to our future and our prosperity, with no great alliance, of course, and great relationship with China anymore. And India's nascent and growing, so that trading link, if we had it, could be valuable, but it'll take a long time to materialize and displace having a relationship with the other three. And so one thing we have to do is we do need a trading strategy that allows us to link ourselves to the four biggest engines of global growth and global power. And that's got to be one part of it. And that creates prosperity in the country. Two, this is a highly innovative country. We per capita, but even in absolute terms, are an enormous innovative engine. And so the investment in science and technology that will define the next civilization needs to come out of this country. And some of those seeds are laid, but not enough and not at the scale. And I'm not sure you can do it at the scale unless you're a rich country, and we've been getting poorer. So we have a challenge. It's an enormous challenge to figure out how to find the money and to make this country a place that people invest to tap our innovation, because it's a very profitable innovation that this country generates.
Yes.
The third part is we cannot hold on to fossil fuels. I mean, it's part of the transition, but we have to have a real strategy to transition. And for an island surrounded by wind and water, and of course the ability to figure out technologies and an investment in fusion and other new technologies, we have to have a strategy that sets the pace and shows that we're one of the leaders in this transition. And finally, sorry, Tim, sorry to interrupt what you were saying earlier, but you're about to ask me, but this country has always been successful because of its links to the rest of the world. And the new markets that are growing in the global south and in countries like India too. And it would be very smart for us to have the best of relationships with those high growth countries, as well as the big demand rich countries that are in the EU and America and Japan and so on, but the high growth, so that our growth is anchored in some way to theirs, and that we facilitate that growth as a fantastic financial center with the IP, the intellectual property to do so.
Yeah.
And I think those are some of the building blocks of our strategy going forward. This government or the next or the one after will have to figure it out, because that's the way forward.
Right, we're looking at a global view of this. Matthew Leach is asking again, which countries are most and least open to the 15 solutions that you've identified? Are there countries that are likely to lag behind the rest of the world as a result?
So which countries are, sorry, least?
Are least open to the 15 solutions that you've identified. So it's the top and the bottom.
Sure. So here's what we're finding. Everyone is open to the SDGs. Literally, they reaffirmed again in September at the UN that they're aligned. The problem is the capital is not flowing to where it's needed because the private sector is not finding it, the risk and the rewards of investing and the governance required exist in the places where they could invest and the capital can make a difference. So it's not the spiritual or psychological openness to it. It's creating the conditions. And this is why policy is probably nearly a third of the answer. Most countries need help to establish the policies that will allow capital to flow. And I think this is an enormous role for multilateral institutions around the world to work with countries to see if they can help establish the conditions so that the capital flows freely to the places where it's needed and it can be profitably then taken back. People seem to think, because it's $450 trillion, that it must be the financial institutions that are to blame. And what I found is, of course, they can do more. But actually, the financial institutions hold the money that all of us give them. It's our current accounts and our savings accounts and our pensions and our insurance policies and so on. And they're not at liberty to move that to places that are risky and cannot deliver the return. So creating the conditions is the biggest problem. And it is, unfortunately, that's the case in the poorest of countries. They don't have the conditions. And that's why the money isn't flowing there. And the rifle shot methods that we're using to address issues there are not enough. So it does need a wholesale, almost governance and policy change so that it can happen, so the money can flow. Now, you could argue rich countries have governance issues, and they do. There's corruption in rich countries, and there is fraud, and we see regularly rule of law being bent and twisted and so on. However, financial institutions still feel comfortable. They understand that risk, and so they do allocate there. But the risk in these other places, they're not still comfortable with. Right. And so we have an enormous task to make people comfortable to change it.
Gabriello is coming up with a question about if SGDs require around $130 trillion in investment by 2030, re-gearing financial services seems to be the key, but then no public or private sector efforts will go anywhere. If the financing isn't there, Dash, what are your thoughts?
Okay, so here's my first thought. The capital is there. If we create the conditions in terms of where it's required, it will flow and flow profitably and flow back profitably. The challenge is, can we create those conditions for the capital to flow? I do think, as everything transitions, new financial institutions will be born that are much more suited to taking this risk at a return that is much more satisfactory for that kind of risk. And so those new financial institutions I see in many parts of the world when I travel, I see financial institutions that serve the very poor at very reasonable interest rates, understanding the risk, structuring for that risk, and making sure they can still deliver a return. those institutions will scale enormously and end up being the financial institutions of the future. There would have been a time when banks that served, or financial institutions or financiers that served agriculture were the leaders, and that was pre-industrial revolution. Today, the financial institutions that are most successful serve industrial, financial, and other private sector institutions. In the future, as we transition, given the global south and the poorest in-rich countries are the next frontier, the financial institutions that can serve those the best, do it really well, risk managed, are the ones that will be the giants of the future. This is a natural transition you see, and one that is almost bound to happen.
Right. Ian Harris and Anthony Lowther have come up with related questions. Firstly, where do you think the lead should come from for most of these potential solutions? And Anthony is asking, how can the City of London contribute to these aims right now?
Fantastic. So look, we gave 15 as a starter for 10, if you like. That's it. You know, we just said, here's 15. We've beaten the 10. Now other people need to find solutions and execute them. So one thing the city, of course, should be doing is finding the biggest of solutions in corporations, in financial institutions, in non-government organizations and charities and foundations, and looking for partners that allow them to really scale those solutions and make those nationwide and regional and global solutions. And it would be great to see the Lord Mayor's team sponsor some of these solutions, champion them, so that they become international and they really make their impact. That would deliver enormous value to the country, to the city too, but to the whole country. And that should be one part of it. In terms of what we do overall, I would love to see the United Nations, the World Bank and others have an effort where it's completely solution focused, and the scaling of solutions, the administration of solutions around the world, working across the private sector, the NGOs, putting together those groups. And they do a lot of this. It's just if we stop thinking the banks are going to give us the money, which they are mandated not to almost, and we follow the solutions, the money will follow the solutions. And that's the answer.
Right, well, that leads into two rather critical questions about India and China. You might not be surprised. Ian Stewart is raising questions about India with the size of its GDP, the question of pollution, coal output, high levels of poverty, and may one even say corruption. And Deepak is wondering whether China can overtake America as holding the reserve currency of the world. There must be major political implications there as well as economic ones. What is your view about the future of both China and India?
So if I start with China, China has demonstrated its ability to take one of the largest populations of poor people out of poverty. It took them, if you look at the curve of it, it's quite interesting. There's a period of about 50 years where it's just flatlining its growth and its prosperity. And then there's a period of about 7 years when all of a sudden the growth goes up enormously. Then there's a period of 3 years where the curve steepens even further and the growth and prosperity keeps growing. And then it starts to tail off. In that period, the growth is driven by enormous production. And then at some stage, it starts to become much more consumption-led. And then it's a great trading power through all that period. And at some point, it wants to be somebody that attracts the capital of the world. It seems to be going through a stage right now, though, where it is much more close to the world than it was maybe half a decade or a decade ago. And so it has faltered in terms of its path of openness, perhaps, for reasons that it explains in terms of wanting to sort out its own governance. Now, there are many reasons for that, but even if we ran lots of models, even if China grows at 2 or 3%, even 2%, there's a point at which it overtakes the US just because the scale of it, of 1.4 billion people. And that answers to when it takes over is somewhere between 2030 and 2040, and in one model between 2040 and 2045. And so there is a point at which this intersection becomes very important. I would still, though, not place a bet against American innovation and ability to grow another America inside the industrial America. So, of course, there is a populist movement that says we've let go of industrial jobs and we should not. But there is another America inside America which is driven by technology and innovation and is investing in almost every part of innovation and that can be the future engine of America's growth. So this is going to be a hard-fought battle. It just so happens at this stage that China outspends America and the rest of the world on every major area of technology. And so this is a hard-fought battle, probably fought between 2030 and 2040 to see who has economic supremacy. And so that's where effectively we're heading. In terms of India, India's on that same curve, just about a decade and a half behind China. And so its growth is also driven like that. Every engine of growth we found, if we take China as an example for India, there was a big flatline period post-independence, then a period where 7 years of enormous growth, 3 years of even steeper growth. It's expected that by 2030 to 2035, the Indian GDP of $3 trillion will double, nearly triple over a 10-year period. So one of the most interesting investments is to make an investment in that growth. Tying yourself to that growth means you get 2 to 3 times your money. That growth usually, to begin with, for China too, was a dirty growth, as it was for Europe, as it was for America. It's dependent on old energies. India, though, is committed to a cleaner growth that is linked to it, the fact that it's a very hot country, has huge amounts of solar potential, has also wind potential and many other things, but to a clean growth path. We all need it to be a clean growth path. And I think the support of the EU and America in terms of technology transfer, trading, and so on, to help that happen is critical to all of us, really. I think we're realizing how interrelated and interconnected the world is. A war in the Middle East is not that far away. It affects us in London, in every major city of the world. Same in Ukraine, the same would be true in Asia, which is that interdependent as humanity.
Very, very interesting. I'm afraid the screen showing the forthcoming lectures indicates that we're running short of time now. As it's up, let me remind you, we have the state of play with fusion for you technical types, ending the destruction of our undersea cultural heritage for you historical types, and then the opportunity in digital markets, which I think will affect everybody. Ketan, I found your slides extremely informative. So everyone, if you want to go on the Gresham Society website at greshamsociety.org, you will be able to review this and the lecture. And Ketan, to find out more about Force for Good, where can people look for that?
So please do look at forcegood.org, www.forcegood.org, and you'll find we give away a huge amount of content and some fantastic interviews with exciting, dynamic, innovative people who want to be a force for good themselves. Right. And I hope everyone will too here. Right,
talking about forceful, innovative people wishing to change the world for the better, I was going to mention that our Lord Mayor Michael Mainelli has drawn on the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals as the basis for his targets during the year, and we brought those down to the 6 Ps: posterity and planet, people and possibility, prosperity and productivity. And that does actually find its way through different areas of work of the Corporation of the City of London. And the other thing is that Michael's coffee colloquies will also be based on the full list of 17 topics. However, being Michael, he's suggesting that there's several more, and he would like to add space protection insurance, ethical artificial intelligence, and philanthropy and investment. So I think we look forward to hearing more about all of that. In the meantime, thank you everybody for watching the Lord Mayor's lectures in the Square Mile, and do remember that Michael's theme for the year is Connect to Prosper. Ketan, I think you've given us a lot of suggestions as to how we might in future. Thank you everybody, and goodbye.